A Helix Vanguard story. Yet, bam. They said the building was untouchable. They were wrong. Inside the most secure corporate tower in America, a $1 billion betrayal was already in motion, planted not by outsiders, but by the very people trusted to protect it. When the lights died and the smoke came, every hired gun with a badge turned and ran. Every polished professional with a six-figure salary disappeared into the chaos. What none of them counted on, what no one counted on, was the quiet man in the gray uniform who stayed. The man nobody noticed. The man nobody knew. This is not a story about power. It's about the person they forgot to fear. If this story already has you hooked, you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. We release new cinematic audio stories every week, and trust me, you do not want to be the last one to find out what happens next. Drop a like if you're already feeling the tension, and leave a comment below telling me your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. All right, let's go. The elevator at Helix Vanguard's headquarters made a sound on Tuesday mornings that nobody else seemed to hear. It was subtle, a faint mechanical hesitation between the 14th and 15th floors, lasting maybe half a second before the cab leveled out and the doors opened like nothing had happened. Most people were staring at their phones when it happened. The ones who weren't were already moving before the doors finished parting, coffee cups in hand, minds locked on whatever meeting or deadline waited on the other side. Ethan Drake heard it every single time. He stood in the service corridor outside the elevator shaft on that particular Tuesday morning with a laminated work order clipped to his chest and a socket wrench in his left hand, listening to the building the way other men listen to music, patiently, with the kind of attention that couldn't be faked or trained in a classroom. He had been listening to buildings for 3 years now. Before that, he had listened to jungles, coastal approaches, and the breathing patterns of men who wanted him dead. That was a different life. He didn't think about it much anymore. He tried not to. Drake. A voice from the end of the corridor. Marcus Webb, the facility's supervisor, a heavy-set man in his early 50s who managed a clipboard like it was a weapon. You finished the panel diagnostic on 18? Done at 6:40, Ethan said without turning around. Flagged a grounding issue on circuit breaker 7. Left the report on your desk. On my desk? Marcus repeated it with the flat, vaguely irritated tone of a man who had expected to find nothing and was mildly inconvenienced by finding something. You always do that. You always leave a report. That's the job? The job is to fix what's broken, not write novels about it. Marcus flipped a page on his clipboard. HVAC, filter replacement, floors 20 through 23. Get it done before noon. Ethan nodded. Marcus was already walking away. The corridor was empty again. The elevator groaned softly behind the wall. Ethan Drake was 37 years old and built in a way that didn't announce itself. Lean through the shoulders, economical in movement, the kind of physical presence that registered as unremarkable until you noticed the specific way he held a room without trying to. He wore a gray Helix maintenance uniform that was slightly too short in the sleeve and carried a belt with more tools than the average technician would know how to use. His face had the settled quality of someone who had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. He had a daughter named Cora. She was 8. She liked drawing horses on the backs of his work orders and making him watch the same animated movie about a girl who turns into a bear approximately once every 11 days. He had seen it 43 times. He knew every line. She was the reason he had taken this job. The hours were predictable. The work was physical but manageable. And when his shift ended at 4:30, he could be at her school by 4:50, standing at the pickup line with the other parents, none of whom had any idea that the quiet man in the gray uniform had once been inserted into denied territory under cover of darkness, with nothing but a communications device, a rifle, and 4 other men he trusted with his life. He didn't miss it. Most days. Helix Vanguard occupied the top 20 floors of a 52-story tower in the financial district, a building that had been designed by architects who clearly believed that glass and steel could communicate authority without trying. The company itself developed proprietary cybersecurity infrastructure for defense contractors, private finance institutions, and 3 different federal agencies whose names the general public had never heard spoken aloud. It was the kind of company that made the news only when it didn't want to, which is to say, almost never. Adrienne Kane had been its CEO for 14 months. She was 30 years old, which made her the second youngest chief executive of a publicly traded defense-adjacent company in the country, a fact she had stopped being interested in approximately 11 months ago. The first time a journalist led with her age, she had been politely corrective. By the fourth time, she had started ending interviews early. She was in her office on the 41st floor at 7:15 that morning, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows with a cup of green tea she hadn't touched, looking out at a city that was still gray with early light. Behind her, 3 tablets were arranged on her desk showing different data streams, and her assistant, a 26-year-old named Priya with the organizational instincts of a field general, was already on her second cup of coffee in the outer office. "The Meridian team lands at 9, Priya said through the open door. "Full delegation, 8 people. Contract review is scheduled for 10, lunch at 12:30, signing ceremony at 2. Media access is limited to the lobby and the atrium. Security cleared everything last night." "The backup generator test?" Adrienne asked. "Completed at midnight. All systems nominal." "And the redundant network partition on floors 38 through 42? A brief pause. Priya appeared in the doorway. "I'll check." "Check now." Adrienne finally turned from the window. She was not a tall woman, but she had the specific stillness of someone who had decided early on that stillness was its own form of authority. Dark hair pulled back, minimal jewelry, a charcoal blazer that was fitted without being theatrical. "This contract is $8.4 billion, and the Meridian Group has pulled out of 2 other deals in the last 18 months because of security concerns. I want everything verified, every system, every backup." "Understood." Priya was already on her phone. Adrienne sat down at her desk and opened the security brief her chief of security, a man named Ronald Fitch, had submitted the previous afternoon. It was thorough. 62 contracted guards on site, divided between lobby control, executive floor coverage, and perimeter monitoring, biometric access restrictions on all floors above 35. Visitor management protocol locked to a short list of authorized personnel. Fitch ran a tight operation. He had come from private military contracting and had the resume to prove it. 2 decades of high-value asset protection, corporate espionage prevention, crisis management. Adrienne had never entirely trusted him. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way he smiled at the wrong moments in meetings. Maybe it was instinct. She had learned not to dismiss instinct. She read the brief anyway, because that was also part of the job. Ethan found the anomaly at 9:47 in the morning. He had been working through the HVAC filter replacement on floor 22 when he noticed the access panel to the building's secondary network junction was slightly ajar. Not broken, not forced, just not fully closed, the way it should have been. The magnetic latch disengaged as though someone had opened it carefully and then failed to push it all the way shut on the way out. He stood in the utility corridor for a moment looking at it. He opened it the rest of the way. The secondary junction routed backup data signals to the building's core security system, the cameras, the badge readers, the emergency lockdown protocols. What he was looking at was not supposed to be accessible from this corridor at all. The routing panel should have been sealed behind a secondary latch controlled by a keycard that only the head of facilities and the security director carried. Except it wasn't sealed, and someone had been in here. He crouched down with a small flashlight and looked at the connection points. Everything appeared normal from a distance. He moved the flashlight closer. There, running alongside the standard cabling thin as a strand of optical fiber, practically invisible against the gray housing, was a secondary tap. A physical intercept device. Not the kind of thing you bought off a shelf. The kind of thing that was built by someone who knew exactly how this system worked. Ethan sat back on his heels. He thought about that for a while. Then he took out his phone and photographed everything. The panel, the device, the connection points, the surrounding cable arrangement. I was methodical about it, the way he was methodical about everything, moving the camera to cover every angle without touching anything he didn't have to touch. He clipped the panel mostly shut again and went to find Marcus Webb. Marcus listened to him with the expression of a man hearing a language he didn't fully speak. "A tap," he repeated. "A signal intercept. Someone put it there after the last maintenance inspection. I checked the access log on the panel. It was opened 4 days ago at 2 in the morning by a credential registered to a contractor who hasn't been on site in 6 weeks. So someone spoofed the credential." "Yes." Marcus scratched the back of his neck. Ethan, you do HVAC filters and door calibrations. What do you know about network taps? Ethan had expected this question. Enough, he said. I've seen them before. Where? He held Marcus's gaze for a moment. I read a lot. Marcus made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite dismissal, but lived somewhere in between. Look, I'll put it in the incident log and flag it for the IT security team. The contract signing is today, Ethan said, at 2 o'clock. I know when it is. Everyone in the building knows when it is. The tap is on the secondary network junction that feeds the security system. If someone wanted to compromise the building's internal monitoring during a specific window of time, during something like a contract signing with limited outside access protocols. Ethan, Marcus held up a hand. You're a good technician, a really good one, but you're not a security analyst, and this isn't your call to make. I'll flag it. They'll look at it, okay? Ethan looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once. Okay, he said. He walked back to the service elevator and stood in it alone on the ride up to 23, watching the floor numbers change. The elevator made its half-second hesitation between 14 and 15. He barely noticed. By 11 o'clock, he had sent the photographs to 3 people. Marcus Webb, the IT security contact listed on the internal directory, and the general facilities inbox that technically went to a department assistant named Devin, who spent most of his time watching sports highlights on a monitor. He had turned slightly away from the main foot traffic. By 11:45, he had received no response from any of them. He tried a different approach. He walked to the security desk on the lobby level and asked for Ronald Fitch. The guard at the desk, a young man named Torres with a close-trimmed beard and an earpiece that wasn't connected to anything Ethan could identify, told him Fitch was in a pre-ceremony briefing and could not be disturbed. It's about a network anomaly in the secondary junction on floor 22, Ethan said. The building's security cameras and lockdown protocols run through that junction. I found an intercept device. I have photographs. Torres looked at him with the careful blankness of someone who had been trained to look at maintenance workers exactly the way maintenance workers expected to be looked at. I'll let him know you stopped by. That's really not... Ethan stopped, took a breath. Can I leave the photographs with you? Sure. Torres took the printed copies Ethan had made at the facility's printer without really looking at them and placed them on the desk to his right, next to a half-eaten protein bar and a coffee thermos. Ethan stood there for another moment. Thanks, he said, because there was nothing else to say. He went back upstairs. The maintenance tunnels beneath Helix Vanguard's executive floors were not on any public schematic. They had been built into the original structure as a concession to the building's complex mechanical and electrical infrastructure, tight, utilitarian corridors that ran parallel to the main floor plans, accessible through unmarked utility doors that required a facilities-level keycard. Ethan had memorized the entire layout in his first month on the job, not because he'd planned to use the knowledge for anything specific, but because knowing the shape of a space was simply how his mind worked. Old habit. He was in the tunnel on floor 39 at 1:15 in the afternoon, replacing a failed sensor in a climate control unit when he heard voices through the ventilation grate above him. 2 men. Low, careful tones. Not the controlled volume of professionals having a private conversation, the deliberate quiet of men saying something they didn't want carried. He stopped moving, set down his wrench without a sound. Confirmation window is 90 seconds from the initial blackout. Any longer, and the federal relay picks up the signal loss. Cole's people know the window. A different voice. Older. More measured. The voice of a man accustomed to having decisions accepted rather than questioned. The detonators are already in place. Everything happens in sequence, or nothing happens at all. And the girl? The first voice asked. Girl. Not woman. Girl, as though the subject of the word hadn't earned a different designation. Adrian Kane is not a problem. She'll be contained in the chaos like everyone else. A long pause. You're sure Fitch's people are holding their positions? Fitch's people are holding exactly the positions I told them to hold. That's what happens when you pay someone enough to forget they ever had a conscience. Ethan was already processing grid layout of the current floor, position of the service tunnel exits, distance to the nearest communication terminal that wasn't routed through the building's primary network junction. His hands were perfectly still. His breathing was slow and even. He knew that second voice. He had heard it in 3 board meetings he'd serviced the AV setup for in the last 6 months. A man named Vincent Hale, who sat on Helix Vanguard's board of directors and had the particular social ease of someone who had spent his entire adult life never being told no. The voices moved away from the grate. Ethan sat in the tunnel alone in the near dark, with the climate control unit humming steadily beside him. The contract signing was in 45 minutes. He had photographs nobody had looked at and knowledge nobody would believe, and a cell phone that could make calls to people who wouldn't pick up in time. And a secondary distress transmitter, a compact personal emergency locator, the kind of thing he had carried for 11 years out of a habit he'd never quite managed to break, clipped to the inside of his tool belt underneath a roll of electrical tape. He pulled it out, looked at it, pressed the activation sequence with his thumb. The signal was already moving, bouncing off relay towers and satellite nodes toward a federal emergency coordination frequency that would log the transmission and flag it for review. In an ideal world, someone would respond before the ceremony started. In a building where a maintenance technician's warnings had been cheerfully ignored all morning, ideal was a word that had stopped being useful. He put the transmitter back on his belt. He picked up his wrench. 44 minutes. He started moving toward the stairs. At 1:47, Ethan Drake stood at the edge of the executive atrium on the 40th floor, wearing his gray maintenance uniform with a small grease stain on the left sleeve that Cora had told him, with genuine solemnity, looked like a horse if you squinted. The Meridian delegation was already assembled around the long conference table visible through the glass partition wall. 8 people in expensive suits, their collective body language radiating the specific kind of corporate patience that costs a great deal of money to manufacture. Adrienne Kane stood at the head of the table with a pen in her hand and a document in front of her that represented more than a decade of her company's ambition distilled into 73 pages of contract language. She looked, from where Ethan stood, completely composed, controlled, like a woman who had run every calculation and found them all acceptable. He watched her for a moment. Then he looked at the security panel near the atrium entrance, the small display that monitored the building's internal system status. All green, every indicator showing nominal, which meant the tap was still active, waiting. Ethan pressed his back against the wall near the service door and checked his watch. 1:49. Somewhere below them, in the mechanical spaces that everyone trusted and nobody thought about, something was already counting down. The lights died at exactly 1:51. Not a flicker, not the gradual dimming of a system struggling. A clean, decisive cut. The kind that happens when someone who knows what they're doing reaches into a building's nervous system and severs the right nerve on the first try. Emergency lighting kicked in 3 seconds later, bathing the executive atrium in a flat amber glow that made everyone look slightly ill. And for a moment the room held its collective breath in the particular way that groups of people do when something goes wrong, but nobody wants to be the first one to say it out loud. Then the smoke came. It didn't pour in the way movie smoke does, dramatically from a single source, giving people time to point at it. It came from the ventilation system simultaneously on 3 sides of the 40th floor, thin at first, then thicker, building the way fog builds over water at dawn. Within 90 seconds, the far end of the atrium was already obscured, and the Meridian delegation, which had spent the better part of the morning maintaining carefully constructed corporate composure, began to come apart at the seams. What is this? The Meridian-led negotiator, a silver-haired man named Caldwell, who had the look of someone perpetually disappointed by the world's failure to meet his standards, stood up so fast his chair rolled back and hit the wall. What's happening? Stay calm. Adrienne was already on her feet, the unsigned contract still sitting on the table in front of her. She had her phone out and was dialing Fitch's direct line. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She tried the security desk. Same result. Priya? But Priya wasn't in the room. She had stepped out 5 minutes earlier to manage a catering issue on the floor below, and now the line Adrienne dialed connected to a ringing phone on an empty desk. Across the glass partition, Ethan saw the smoke before the emergency lighting finished cycling. He had been standing at the edge of the service corridor for the past 2 minutes with his hand on the utility door handle, watching the security panel display that had shown all green, watching it change. The first indicator to go was camera coverage on floors 38 through 40. Then the badge reader network dropped. Then the display itself went dark. 12 seconds of total security blackout. He counted them. On the 12th second, he pushed through the service door into the atrium. The executive floor had 4 dedicated security personnel assigned to it during the ceremony. 2 posted at the main elevator bank, 1 at the stairwell entrance, 1 roving between the conference rooms and the atrium. Ethan saw all 4 of them in the span of about 8 seconds, and what he saw made something cold settle in his chest. The specific cold of a man recognizing a pattern he had hoped he was wrong about. The 2 guards at the elevator bank were moving toward the stairs, not toward the CEO, not toward the smoke, away. One of them already had his jacket off, folding it over his arm in the practiced motion of someone changing out of a costume after a performance. The stairwell guard had his back to the atrium, his radio in his hand, speaking into it in a low and rapid voice. The rover was simply gone. Ethan pushed through the gathering smoke toward the glass partition, and through it he could see Adrienne Kane standing at the head of the conference table with her phone pressed to her ear and her expression doing that specific thing that faces do when the person behind them is running calculations very fast and not liking any of the results. The Meridian delegation was fragmenting. 2 people on phones, 1 man trying the conference room door and finding it still functional, Caldwell demanding explanations from nobody in particular. Ethan pulled the glass partition door open. "Ms. Kane." She turned, looked at him. The gray uniform, the tool belt, the grease stain on his sleeve. Her eyes ran a quick assessment that was more competent than she probably knew. "Who are you?" "Maintenance. Ethan Drake. We need to move right now." "The security team is leaving." He said it flat, because there was no version of it that was gentle and no time to look for one. "I watched them go, all 4. This was planned. The blackout, the smoke, the personnel positions. Someone bought your security team, and whoever comes through that door in the next 2 minutes is not here to help." Caldwell appeared at his elbow. "Now, listen, sir." Ethan looked at him directly. "I need you to take your people down the northwest stairwell to floor 35 and hold there. The smoke is a dispersal agent, not a fire. It's designed to create chaos and separate people. The stairwell is clear. Go now, and don't stop moving." Caldwell stared at him. "You're a maintenance man." "Yes." Ethan didn't elaborate. Something about the plainness of it, the absolute lack of performance, made Caldwell take a half step back. He turned to his team. "Northwest stairwell," he said, in the tone of a man who had decided that complaining could wait. "Let's go." Ethan turned back to Adrienne. She hadn't moved. "You too," he said. "I'm not leaving my building." "You're not staying on this floor. There's a difference." He moved to the atrium door and held it open. "Please." She came. He noted that she didn't hesitate after she decided, just picked up her phone and walked, which told him something useful about how she operated. They were in the maintenance corridor with the utility door closed behind them when the elevator bank on the far side of the atrium opened and the first of them stepped out. Ethan saw it through the narrow observation window in the door. A man in a Helix security uniform who moved wrong, not the loose territorial movement of a guard running toward an emergency. The tight, economical movement of someone trained for entry. He had a compact tactical radio in one hand, and he wasn't using it to call for help. He was listening. There were 3 more behind him. "Sub-level maintenance," Ethan said quietly, already moving. "Stay close and don't talk." Adrienne followed him into the corridor without a word. The smoke hadn't reached the maintenance tunnels yet, which meant they had a window. Narrow, but real. Ethan moved through it the way water moves through the path of least resistance. Not running, not dawdling, but covering ground with the efficiency of someone who has memorized the distance between every point in a space and knows which corners to cut. He was also thinking, rapidly and without a great deal of room for error, about what he had. A building he knew better than anyone currently trying to control it. A tool belt with items that could be repurposed if he was creative. A personal emergency transmitter that was broadcasting but hadn't been acknowledged. And a woman walking 3 feet behind him who was either going to be an asset or a liability depending on factors he hadn't fully assessed yet. "Where are we going?" Adrienne asked. Her voice was low and steady. "Asset," he noted. "Sub-basement. There's a mechanical operations room below the parking structure. It's not on the standard building schematic. The entrance is through a utility passage that requires a facilities-level access card." He held up his keycard briefly. "Mine works." "How do you know it's not on the schematic?" "Because I've been in this building for 3 years and I've never seen anyone else go near it. They passed through a junction where two maintenance corridors intersected, and Ethan stopped, held up a hand, listened. 40 feet down the left corridor, a door opened and closed. He steered them right without breaking pace. The security blackout was 12 seconds, he said, more to organize his own thinking than to inform her. That's the window they needed to drop the camera network and reroute the badge readers. The smoke deployment was simultaneous, which means they had access to the building's environmental controls. That's not something you hack from the outside. Someone was inside this system before today. The tap, Adrian said. He glanced back at her. Secondary network junction, floor 22, she said. I got your photographs at 11:15 this morning. The IT security lead flagged them to Fitch's office at noon. Ethan processed that. Fitch. I know. Her voice had a particular quality, not bitterness exactly, the specific exhaustion of someone who suspected something and was now watching it confirmed. I didn't put it together until about 30 seconds ago. Did you tell anyone else about the photographs? No. Priya saw the forwarded message, but not the contents. Then whoever Fitch reported to knows I found the tap, which means they know someone in the building was paying attention. He stopped at a utility door, swiped his card, and pushed through into a narrow descending staircase that smelled of concrete and recycled air. Watch the third step. It's cracked. She watched the step. The staircase took them down 2 levels below the parking structure to a corridor that was barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. The ceiling was low and threaded with conduit and pipe, and the lighting was the old fluorescent kind that hummed at a frequency just above human comfort. Ethan moved along it with the ease of someone who had walked it enough times that it felt familiar, even in the bad light. The mechanical operations room at the end of the corridor was roughly 30 feet by 20, crowded with the building's secondary electrical distribution hardware, a row of aging HVAC control panels, and a steel workbench along the far wall where Ethan had spent several afternoons doing diagnostic work on components that were technically past their service life but still functional. He had a habit of working in here when the upper floors felt too loud. He pulled the door shut behind them and engaged the manual latch, a heavy steel bar that dropped into a floor bracket, original to the building, installed before electronic locking systems were standard. He had always liked that about this room. Nothing electronic, nothing hackable. Adrian looked around the space. He watched her taking stock. Not panicking, not freezing, just looking, the way a person looks when they're rebuilding their understanding of a situation from the ground up. The people in the elevator, she said. Mercenaries? Yes. And the smoke, the blackout, the security team walking out. She sat down on the edge of the workbench, which was not an especially comfortable place to sit, but was functional, and she seemed like the type who prioritized function. This wasn't improvised. No, it took weeks. Access credentials, building systems knowledge, personnel positioning, someone with deep access planned this. How many of them? I counted 4 on the executive floor. That's just the visible element. A coordinated operation like this, you'd want at least 12 in total, probably more. Entry teams, corridor coverage, stairwell control, external perimeter. He was moving as he talked, going to the workbench and opening the lower cabinet where he kept a secondary kit, spare components, basic electrical tools, and some items that were not strictly standard maintenance inventory. The good news is they don't know this room exists. How long does that last? Depends on how thorough they are. If they're working off the standard building schematic, we have time. If they have someone who actually knows this building, he stopped. What? They'd need someone with facilities-level access knowledge, not just the schematics, the operational knowledge. Which systems are connected to which, where the override points are, what the maintenance logs look like. He set down a length of heavy-gauge electrical cable. The person who opened the access panel 4 days ago, 2 in the morning, spoofed credential. You think they've been inside the maintenance system? I think whoever planned this knew things they shouldn't know unless someone walked them through it, or walked it for them. He looked up. Does Fitch have access to facilities management records? Adrian was quiet for a moment. Security directors have read access to building operations logs. It's standard for emergency response coordination. Ethan nodded once, slowly. Okay, she said. Her hands were on her knees and she was looking at the floor. Not defeated, thinking. He could tell the difference. What do we have? He appreciated the we. It was a practical word, no sentimentality in it. We have this room. We have the maintenance tunnel network. I know every junction, every access point, every dead end, and every shortcut. We have my tool belt. He spread the contents of the lower cabinet on the workbench. And we have the secondary emergency transmitter I activated at 1:49, which is broadcasting to a federal coordination frequency. If anyone picked it up, response time is somewhere between 40 minutes and 2 hours, depending on how fast they verify and mobilize. 40 minutes minimum? Yes. Adrian looked at the contents of the workbench. Then she looked at him. You activated an emergency transmitter before the attack started, she said slowly. I heard voices through a ventilation grate at 1:15. I recognized one of them. Who? He met her eyes. Vincent Hale. The room was very quiet for a moment. The HVAC control panel hummed. Vincent. She said his name the way you say the name of something you'd rather not have confirmed. He's been on the board for 6 years. I know. He was the one who pushed the Meridian contract hardest. He has more to gain from controlling Helix than anyone outside of... She stopped. Something was moving behind her eyes, a rapid internal reorganization. He doesn't want the contract signed. He wants the company. If the signing fails, the board has emergency governance authority. If Adrian Kane is... She caught herself. If I'm incapacitated during a crisis of this magnitude, the board assumes interim control and Vincent chairs the board. And with Fitch's team positioning to let the mercenaries operate freely, he controls the building. He controls the narrative. She put her hands flat on the workbench. He tells whatever story he wants about what happened here today. Ethan pulled a spool of heavy-duty wire from the cabinet. Not if we don't let him. He began to work. It was methodical, the way everything he did was methodical. Not showy, not fast for the sake of appearing capable, just deliberate. He stripped lengths of wire at specific intervals and connected them to a pair of components from the electrical cabinet, explaining none of it because there was nothing about it that required explanation at this stage. Adrian watched him for approximately 40 seconds before she did something he hadn't expected. What can I do? She asked. He looked at the layout of the room. The conduit running along the north wall, the orange banded one. I need to know which panels it connects to on the sub-basement level. There's a junction schematic mounted on the back of the middle HVAC unit. Fold-out laminated card, should be orange with black text. She found it in about 20 seconds. She was efficient. He noted that too. They worked in silence for a while, and it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of two strangers thrown together by circumstance. It was a working silence, functional, the kind that develops when two people have enough going on that words are optional. Above them, in the building they couldn't see, something was happening. They both knew it. Neither of them said it, because saying it wouldn't change anything. Then a sound. Footsteps in the corridor outside. Not the random footfall of someone moving through. The measured, deliberate pace of a search pattern. Slow, systematic, stopping at intervals. Ethan set down his wire and looked at the door. The heavy steel bar was engaged. He looked at the HVAC units along the south wall. Large enough to create cover, close enough to the door to be tactically useful, old enough that their steel housings were solid rather than the hollow sheet metal construction of newer units. He pointed at the space behind the two rightmost units without making a sound. Adrian moved there without being asked twice. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A pause. Ethan counted the seconds in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4. The handle moved, tested against the lock. A soft metallic sound as something was tried against the card reader, which was dead anyway. Another pause. Then a voice muffled through the steel door on a radio. Sub-basement clear, nothing in the mechanical corridor. The footsteps moved away. Adrian came out from behind the HVAC units. She looked at Ethan. He looked back at her. They're using the standard schematic, she said very quietly. Yes. She let out a breath through her nose that was not quite relief and not quite anything else. You said the tunnel network. You know every access point? Every one. Could you move through it without being detected? Could you get to the main security operations hub on floor 32? He thought about the route. The maintenance tunnel dropped to sub-level 2 behind the parking structure, ran east for about 80 feet, then accessed a vertical service chase that connected to the building's core at intervals on floors 12, 20, 28, and 34. From 34 to 32 was a single stairwell that accessed the operations hub through a mechanical room. The route avoided every main corridor, every elevator bank, every position a 12-man team would logically cover. Yes, he said. The operations hub has an independent hardline communications terminal that isn't routed through the main network junction. It runs on a separate fiber line that connects directly to the building's ISP relay. It was installed as a last resort communications backup, and only 3 people in the company know it exists. She paused. It would let us transmit directly, not a passive distress signal, an active voice transmission to the Federal Emergency Coordination Center. Ethan looked at her. You know about the hard line. I know about everything in this building, she said, and there was something in her voice that was neither arrogance nor defensiveness. Just plain fact, the way a person who has spent 14 months learning every part of something states what they know. I had a reason to learn. He turned back to the workbench and began disconnecting the components he'd been assembling, reconfiguring them for a different purpose. We're not splitting up, he said. If I go to the operations hub, you come with me. I wasn't suggesting otherwise. And when we move through the tunnels, you do exactly what I do exactly when I do it. No discussion. She looked at him steadily. I already did that in the staircase. He almost said something, didn't. He finished the reconfiguration and clipped the assembled unit to his tool belt. It was ugly, stripped wire ends and electrical tape and a repurposed circuit relay, but it would function as a rudimentary motion alert at the door if they had to leave the room unattended. He ran a wire from it to a loose terminal on the HVAC panel and tested the connection once. Ready? He asked. Adrian straightened, pulled her jacket straight. An automatic gesture, habitual, the kind of thing a person does when they're reminding their body that their mind is still in charge. Yes, she said. Ethan lifted the steel bar from the floor bracket, opened the door, and checked both ends of the corridor in a single practiced motion. Clear. He moved into the corridor and she was a half step behind him, and they went into the dark of the maintenance tunnels together. The CEO of a company under siege and the maintenance technician nobody had thought to listen to. And above them the building groaned softly with whatever was happening inside it, and neither of them slowed down. The vertical service chase was accessed through a panel at the east end of the sub-basement corridor, and Ethan had the panel open in under 4 seconds with a flathead screwdriver he'd been carrying on his belt since 7 that morning. The chase itself was narrow, designed for cable runs and pipe access, not human traffic, but navigable if you moved sideways in places and didn't mind the smell of machine oil and the faint hum of electrical current running through conduit an arm's length away. Adrian moved through it without complaint. She scraped her left arm on a pipe bracket and said nothing about it. He noted the scrape, visible through the tear in her jacket sleeve, and noted that she hadn't broken stride. At the access point connecting to floor 28, Ethan stopped and listened for 2 minutes before opening the panel. What he heard was nothing, and nothing was different from clear, but it was the only information available, so he used it. He eased the panel open and looked at a maintenance corridor that was dark except for emergency lighting and smelled of smoke that had filtered down from the floors above. He was about to move when he heard the radio traffic. Somewhere on the floor, close, 30 feet maybe, a voice on a tactical radio was relaying position reports. Ethan listened to the cadence of it. 3 units checking in, rotating intervals. The pattern of a coverage team that knew what it was doing. He eased the panel shut and turned to Adrian in the narrow space of the chase and held up 3 fingers. She nodded. They waited. 6 minutes. Then 8. The radio traffic shifted, voices moving, positions changing, the natural movement of a search pattern progressing to the next sector. Ethan opened the panel again. The corridor was clear. They moved. By the time they reached the floor 28 junction and began the ascent toward 34, Ethan's mind had settled into the particular operational clarity that he recognized and distrusted in equal measure. Recognized because it was real, the actual heightened functioning of a brain trained for exactly this kind of environment, and distrusted because of what it said about the part of him that had never fully stood down. The part that was still, even after 3 years of HVAC filters and door calibrations, exactly what it had been trained to be. He thought briefly about Cora, about the horse-shaped grease stain on his sleeve that she had identified with complete confidence, about the fact that school pickup was at 4:50 and it was currently, by his watch, 2:37 in the afternoon. He'd figure it out. He always did. The service chase narrowed near floor 30, and Ethan was navigating a section where a cable bundle had been improperly routed and took up significant space when Adrian spoke for the first time since the sub-basement. "The man whose voice you recognized," she said. "On the ventilation. You said hail." "Yes." "He was talking to someone else." "Yes." "Do you know who?" Ethan moved past the cable bundle and kept climbing. He mentioned a name, Cole. He paused. "The man coordinating the mercenary team. He said Cole's people know the window." He heard Adrian process that behind him. "And the detonators," he added, because she needed to know. He mentioned detonators already in place. A beat of silence in the narrow dark. "Where?" she asked. He didn't say. But in a building like this, if you want structural impact, the kind that creates a narrative for whatever comes after, you target the reinforced core, the load-bearing junction between the building's mechanical basement and the foundation structure, which is directly below where we are right now, she said. "Yes." Another beat. "Okay," Adrian said. "Just that." "Okay." They kept climbing. At floor 34, Ethan opened the chase panel into a mechanical room that served the building's central air handling units. A large, loud, relatively accessible space where the noise of the machinery provided cover that he was grateful for. He checked the mechanical room thoroughly before helping Adrian out of the chase, and then they crossed to the far door in the stairwell that connected downward to 32. The operations hub door was steel, reinforced, with a biometric reader that required executive-level authorization. Adrian pressed her thumb to the reader. The system was on backup power, slower, but functional. It beeped once and the lock disengaged. They were inside. The hub was a compact room, 8 monitors, a central console, and in the far left corner, set into the wall like an afterthought, a simple black handset mounted on a panel with a single LED indicator that glowed steady green, the hard line. Adrian crossed the room and picked up the handset. It connected on the second ring. "Federal Emergency Coordination, Line 7, a voice said, flat, professional, the voice of someone whose job was to receive bad news calmly. Adrian looked at Ethan once. He nodded. "This is Adrian Kane," she said, and her voice was steady. "CEO of Helix Vanguard, 41st floor, tower address on file with your coordination center. We have an active hostile incursion in progress, mercenary force of at least 12 personnel, security staff complicit, and a board member named Vincent Hale who orchestrated the operation." A breath. "I also need you to flag a secondary emergency transmitter that was activated at 1:49 this afternoon and is broadcasting on your coordination frequency. Technician Ethan Drake. He called this 47 minutes ago and nobody answered." There was a pause on the line. "Ms. Kane," the voice said carefully, "can you confirm your location and building access status?" "Hardline terminal, floor 32, operations hub. We are mobile and undetected as of 5 minutes ago." "Understood. Please hold." She held. Ethan stood at the door of the hub with his hand flat against the steel, feeling for vibration, listening to the building around them. Somewhere above, something shifted. A distant metallic sound, structural rather than mechanical. He felt it more than heard it, the way you feel the difference in a house before a storm arrives. He didn't say anything about it. There would be time. Or there wouldn't. He listened to Adrian's voice behind him, precise and measured and not performing calm. Actually calm. The functional calm of a person who has decided that this is the situation and panicking is not a feature of the situation. And he listened to the building around them, and he stayed exactly where he was, at the door, which was where he needed to be. The federal coordinator told them to stay put and wait for tactical response. Ethan listened to Adrian relay that instruction through the handset, watched her nod once and say, "Understood," in the voice of a woman who had decided to understand it, and then watched her hang up the phone and turn to look at him with the expression of someone who had just been told something reasonable that they had no intention of following. "They said 40 minutes minimum," she said. "I heard." "The detonators." "I know." She didn't say anything else because there wasn't anything else to say. 40 minutes in a building with explosives already positioned in the load-bearing structure was not a situation where staying put and waiting felt like a survivable plan, and they both understood that without requiring a conversation about it. Ethan was already thinking about the mechanical basement, The building's reinforced core ran through a central structural column that descended from the lobby level down through 3 sub-basement floors before meeting the foundation. Access to the lowest sub-basement, what the building schematics labeled as S3, a designation that appeared on exactly one document that Ethan had seen during a routine inspection of the elevator mechanical room 14 months ago, was through a service ladder inside the structural column itself, accessible from S1 through a panel he had never had a reason to open. He had a reason now. "I need you to stay here," he said. Adrian looked at him. "The hard line is your direct connection to federal coordination. If something happens to me in the basement and you're not on that line, nobody knows where we are or what's down there." He said it practically, not as an argument, just the layout of the situation as he understood it. "You're more useful here than you are with me in a 3-foot crawl space." She held his gaze for a moment. He could see her working through it, not looking for a reason to disagree, actually calculating, which was different. "How long?" she asked. "If the detonators are where I think they are, 20 minutes. If I'm wrong about the location..." He didn't finish that. "Take this." She pulled the hardline handset slightly away from the wall, enough slack in the cord that it reached the door. "Leave the door open 6 inches. If anything changes up here, I'll call out." He looked at the door, looked at her. "All right," he said. He unclipped his tool belt, removed everything he didn't need, and redistributed weight to the items he did. Wire cutters, insulated pliers, his flashlight, a voltage tester, and the ugly assembled relay unit he'd built in the sub-basement. He checked each item by touch the way he used to check equipment before an insertion, not because the ritual was necessary, but because it settled something in him that needed settling. He was at the door when Adrian spoke. "Drake?" He stopped. She was standing by the hardline console with the handset in her hand and her jacket torn at the sleeve and her hair coming loose from where she'd pinned it, and she looked like what she actually was. A 30-year-old woman having the worst afternoon of her life, doing a reasonable job of not showing it. "Be careful." He nodded once. Then he went. The stairwell from floor 32 to the sub-basement levels was in the building's northeast corner, accessible through a door marked with a yellowed placard that said "Authorized Personnel," "Mechanical Access," the laminate peeling at the corners. Ethan moved through it and descended, listening as he went, counting floors by the painted numbers on the landing walls. S1. S2. At S2 he stopped and listened for 90 seconds. Nothing except the building's own respiration. The cycling of pumps, the low vibration of the electrical distribution system. The particular kind of silence that deep mechanical spaces have. The panel he was looking for was in the east wall of S2, behind a water main riser. He had to move 2 sections of pipe insulation that had been stacked against the wall at some point and never moved, which told him nobody had been behind this panel in years. He found the latch by running his fingers along the wall in the dark with the flashlight in his teeth. And when he found it, he tested it slowly before he opened it, because if someone had wired the panel itself, rushing it would be the last rush thing he ever did. It wasn't wired. He opened it. The service ladder descended into a concrete shaft that smelled of moisture and old steel. His flashlight reached maybe 15 feet down before the dark got too thick. He clipped the flashlight to his collar, tested the first ladder rung with his weight, and went down. S3 was not a room that had ever been intended for human occupation. It was roughly 60 feet long and 20 wide, with a ceiling that followed the undersurface of the S2 floor slab, 7 feet at the highest point, dropping in places where structural elements cut through. The central column that formed the building's load-bearing spine ran through the middle of it, a massive reinforced concrete pillar 4 feet in diameter that disappeared into the floor and ceiling like the trunk of an impossible tree. Utility lines ran along the walls. The floor was bare concrete. The smell was groundwater and metal and something faintly chemical that he identified after a few seconds as primer cord insulation. He swept the flashlight around the space slowly. There, on the south face of the central column, roughly 4 feet from the floor, was the first charge. A flat adhesive mount with a compact detonation package and a receiver unit with a single red LED blinking at 2-second intervals. He moved to it without rushing and looked at it without touching it. The receiver unit was standard radio trigger configuration, which meant it was waiting for a signal, which meant it hadn't been triggered yet, which meant he had time. He found the second charge on the northeast face of the column. The third was on the floor itself, set into a joint where the column base met the foundation slab. The worst location of the three, structurally, because a charge at that joint was specifically designed not just to damage the column, but to compromise the separation between the building's vertical load path and the ground it stood on. Someone who placed a charge exactly there understood structural engineering at a level that was not accidental. He crouched over the third charge and looked at it for a long moment. The receiver units on all three were linked. He could see the secondary signal wire running between them, a physical redundancy that meant you couldn't disable one without affecting the others unless you did it in the right sequence. It was not a sophisticated system. It was a careful one. There was a difference. He set his tools out on the floor beside him in order of likely use and got to work. The first receiver came apart cleanly. The antenna lead separated from the trigger circuit with a half turn on a connector that was standard to about 40 different commercial detonation systems. And once the antenna lead was out, the charge was inert, still attached to the column, still capable of being triggered manually, but no longer responsive to the radio signal that was, presumably, sitting in a control unit somewhere in the building waiting to be activated. The second went the same way. The third was different. He had the antenna lead half-turned when he felt the resistance, not mechanical resistance, the resistance of a second connector wired in parallel with the first, a backup trigger. If he disconnected the primary antenna lead without first isolating the secondary circuit, the act of disconnecting would itself complete a circuit that would send current directly to the detonator. He stopped moving, held absolutely still. In the silence of the sub-basement, with his hands on a device that was considerably less forgiving than anything he had dealt with in 3 years of maintenance work, he breathed slowly and thought about the secondary circuit and where it would route. It would route through the signal wire connecting the three charges, which he had been planning to use as his guide to the sequence. If the signal wire was live, if it was carrying current from the backup trigger, then the work he had already done on charges 1 and 2 had not disabled them. It had potentially armed a secondary pathway. He thought about Cora, not as a distraction, as a compass, as the specific, concrete, irreplaceable fact that organized everything else. He removed his hands from the device and looked at the secondary circuit with the flashlight for 2 full minutes, tracing the wire path by eye, mapping it against what he knew about parallel trigger systems from a lifetime ago, in a context he had put away and never planned to open again. The secondary circuit ran not through the signal wire to the other charges. He had misread the routing in the initial sweep. It ran upward, along the south wall, disappearing into a conduit that entered the ceiling. Separate trigger, separate location. The secondary detonator was not down here. He disconnected the primary antenna lead on charge 3 with a clean half-turn and heard nothing except the distant sound of his own pulse. He sat back on the floor of S3 and looked at the 3 inert charges still attached to the column and the foundation joint and felt something that was not quite relief. Relief was for afterward. Relief was a luxury, but was adjacent to it. Functional. Like a calculation resolving to a number that wasn't 0. He had the secondary detonator to find. He was climbing back up the service ladder when he heard the footsteps above him. Not from S2. From the ladder shaft itself, someone was in the shaft, above him, descending. He could hear the measured placement of boots on rungs, careful and deliberate, and he could hear the quality of the silence between steps, which was the silence of someone who was listening as they moved. Ethan stopped on the ladder, calculated the distance. The person above him was approximately 12 feet up, moving slowly. If he went back down, S3 was a box with one exit. If he stayed, he was on a ladder in a 3-foot shaft with no room to do anything useful. He went up. He came out of the hatch into S2 moving fast and low, and the man who had been on the ladder above him was standing 6 feet away with a flashlight in one hand and a radio in the other, and the expression of someone who had heard movement below and came to investigate instead of reporting it, which told Ethan something immediately about the kind of man he was dealing with. The man was big, 6'2", maybe 220 pounds, with a build that was maintained rather than natural, the kind of body that reflects sustained effort rather than genetics. He had close-cut gray at his temples and a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye to his jaw along a path that Ethan recognized as the result of a very specific kind of impact at a very specific angle, the kind of impact that happened in certain environments. He was wearing a Helix security uniform that fit him the way security uniforms never fit the people who actually belong in them. He was looking at Ethan with an expression that was not surprise. It was recognition. "Ethan Drake," the man said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment without knowing exactly when it would arrive. "I wasn't sure it was you until I saw the tattoo in the lobby camera feed. Right forearm, unit designation." He tilted his head slightly. "You still have it." Ethan straightened from his crouch. He looked at the man's face in the combined light of two flashlights and found the shape of a person he had known, underneath the additional years and the gray and the scar. "Darius," he said. Darius Cole smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting for a reaction and was satisfied by the one he got. "Been a while." 11 years. Give or take. Darius set the radio down on a pipe bracket to his right. A deliberate gesture, both hands visible. Not because he was surrendering anything, because he was communicating something. "You look different." "You look the same." "I'll take that." He studied Ethan for a moment. "Maintenance technician." "Yes." "You always were the most stubborn person I ever met. Most people who walked away from the unit found something that paid better than this." "I wasn't looking for better pay." Darius nodded slowly, as though that answer confirmed something he had already known. They had served together for 4 years, 2 deployments, 17 combined operations. The kind of sustained proximity that either destroys men or creates a bond that doesn't have a clean name in civilian language. They had been close. The word felt inadequate, and Ethan was aware of its inadequacy without knowing what to replace it with. "The charges," Ethan said. "Already found them?" "Already neutralized the primary receivers." Something moved across Darius's face. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. "You're faster than I gave you credit for, and I gave you a lot of credit." "The secondary detonator," Ethan said. "Where is it?" Darius looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his security uniform and held up a compact device. Black, the size of a television remote, with a single covered switch and a small digital display showing a countdown that Ethan could not read from 6 feet away. 31 minutes, Darius said, answering the question Ethan hadn't asked. "That's what's left on the timer. Primary receivers were just the backup. This was always the primary. Timer runs to 0. The signal fires automatically. Or..." He tilted the device slightly. "I pushed the button early." Ethan looked at the device. Looked at Darius. "Why are you showing me that?" Darius lowered the device. "Because I want you to understand the situation. Because you're the only person in this building who is actually capable of understanding it. And because..." He paused. "Set the device down on the pipe bracket beside the radio. Both hands. Both objects on the bracket." "I don't want to use it." Ethan waited. "The contract doesn't sign, Hale gets his board control, we get paid and we leave. Nobody gets hurt." Darius's voice had the flat practicality of a man reciting a plan he'd been living with for long enough that it had lost its texture. "That's what was supposed to happen. The mercenaries pushed the signing off the calendar, enough chaos, enough instability that the board invokes emergency governance. Clean. That's not going to happen now." "No, because you called federal coordination 47 minutes ago." He said it without accusation. "Which means He checked his watch. "Somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes, there are tactical units coming through this building, and clean is already off the table." He looked at Ethan directly. "I need a way out of this that doesn't end with me in a cell or in the ground." "Darius." Ethan said his name the way you say the name of a thing you're trying to accurately identify. "You put detonators on a building with several hundred people in it. Charges placed for structural disruption, not casualties. Nobody was going to die. That's a distinction that stops meaning anything the second a detonator fires." Darius was quiet. "The secondary trigger," Ethan said. "Give me the device." Something changed in Darius's expression. Not hardness, exactly. The closing of a door that had briefly been open. "I can't do that. I give you the device. I give you everything. I have nothing left. You have 31 minutes to the timer. 29 now." "Yes." They looked at each other across 6 feet of concrete floor in the sub-basement of a building they both understood better than the people who were supposed to be protecting it, and Ethan saw in Darius's face the thing he had been looking at without naming since the moment they recognized each other. Not the mercenary, not the mission, but the man underneath both of those, who was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the current hour of the day. You have a daughter, Darius said. It wasn't a threat. It landed differently than a threat. Yes. How old? 8. Darius nodded. His jaw shifted slightly. I have a son. He's 12, lives with his mother in Portland. I haven't seen him in 14 months because the last job I took kept me out of the country for most of a year. He picked up the device from the bracket, looked at it. I keep thinking, one more contract, one more payday, and then I go be his father. He looked up. I'm still on the one more contract. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. He thought about the thing Darius had just described, the logic of one more, the postponed return, and recognized it with the specific recognition of someone who had come close to the same logic before choosing differently, before choosing Cora over the version of himself that was still useful in dark sub-basements. The way out, Ethan said, is not this. It never was. I know that. Give me the device. And then what? I sit here and wait for, and then nothing. Ethan cut across him, not loudly. Give me the device, and then we go upstairs, and you tell Federal Coordination exactly what Hale told you, and exactly what he paid you, and exactly who else is involved. You cooperate completely. He met Darius's eyes. I can't promise you anything about what happens after that. I don't have anything to promise with. But the timer runs to 0, and this building comes down, and there's no version of that where you walk away. Darius stood very still. 27 minutes on the timer, give or take. The building above them was occupied by a mercenary team that Darius had brought in, a board member who had paid for the whole operation, a woman on a hardline phone on floor 32, and somewhere at the top of a service ladder, a Federal Coordination Center on hold. Darius held out the device. Ethan took it. For a moment there was nothing in the room but the sound of the building and two men who had once trusted each other with their lives, standing in a concrete basement with the distance of 11 years between them. And then Darius Cole sat down on the floor with his back against the water main riser and put his hands on his knees and said nothing at all. Ethan looked at the device. The display read 2643, counting down. He pulled off the back panel with his thumbnail. Standard construction, the rear plate was designed for battery access, and found the circuit board behind it. The timer relay was identifiable by its position and the type of capacitor flanking it. He didn't have the right tool for a clean disable, so he used what he had. The insulated pliers from his belt, applied to the relay contact with enough lateral pressure to shift it off the circuit pad without completing the backup trigger. The display stopped at 2631. He set the device on the floor. Darius was watching him. Knew you could do it. It's not a complicated device. I didn't mean the device. Ethan picked up his tools and clipped them back to his belt. He looked at Darius on the floor. Then you walk? I can walk. Then get up. Darius got up. He was slower than he used to be. There was something in the way he moved his left knee that suggested an injury that hadn't healed right, the kind of compensation that becomes invisible through repetition, but shows itself when you're sitting on a concrete floor and have to stand up without warning. Ethan noticed it and said nothing about it. They went up the service ladder single file, Ethan first. At S2, Ethan stopped and turned around. The rest of your team, what are their standing orders if they can't reach you? Darius emerged from the hatch behind him. Hold positions until contact. If contact drops for more than 15 minutes, abort and extract. Ethan checked his watch. How long since you last checked in? Darius checked his own watch. Something crossed his face. 11 minutes. Then we have 4 minutes before they start extracting. They'll go for the parking structure exits, which is where Federal Tactical will come in. Ethan looked at the stairwell door. If your people run into a Federal entry team coming through the parking level, it gets complicated, Darius said. His voice had the flat acknowledgement of a man who understood exactly how complicated it got. I need to reach them. Your radio. Darius went back to the bracket and picked up the radio he'd set down. He keyed it twice, a specific pattern, not a standard double click. A brief static response came back. Stand down, Darius said into the radio. All units, stand down. Secure your weapons and hold position. Do not engage any incoming personnel. Acknowledge. A pause. Then, one by one, brief acknowledgments came through. 4, 5, 6 voices, terse and professional. The last one was a longer pause before a voice said, acknowledged, standing down, and then nothing. Darius lowered the radio. Ethan was already at the stairwell door. Let's go. They went up through the building, the maintenance technician and the mercenary, which was not a sentence that had any clean category to fit into, and neither of them tried to put it into one. They went up past S1, past the parking structure level, past the lobby-adjacent mechanical rooms, and at floor 8, Ethan pushed through a utility door into a corridor where the smoke from the upper floors had thinned to a haze, and the emergency lighting was working and the sound of the building had changed. Less active, less the tension of a space occupied by people doing things, and more the tension of a space waiting. On the radio clipped to Darius's belt, a new voice appeared. Crisp, authoritative, the specific diction of federal tactical operations. All personnel in the structure, this is federal law enforcement. We have entered the building at multiple access points. Comply with all instructions immediately. Ethan stopped at the base of the floor, 12 stairwell, and looked up. He needed to get back to floor 32. He needed to get back to Adrian. He also needed, he realized, in the specific, grounded, undramatic way that necessary things present themselves, to end this without anyone else getting hurt. Not because it was noble, because it was the outcome that made the most sense, and he was a person who, when presented with a situation, looked for the outcome that made the most sense. He turned to Darius. You know where Hale is? It wasn't a question. Darius looked at him. He was in the executive conference room on 40 when I last had a position report, waiting for confirmation of the signing collapse. With Fitch? Fitch was supposed to be managing the exit coordination from the security operations hub. Darius paused. Floor 32. Ethan looked at him. Yeah, Darius said. I know. They took the stairs. At floor 28, Ethan heard shouting from somewhere above. Not panic, not combat, but the sharp declarative shouting of people asserting authority, which meant Federal Tactical was moving through the upper floors, and the mercenary team's weapons-down posture was being encountered and processed. Darius walked beside him with his hands slightly away from his body, a posture that communicated cooperating individual rather than combatant, and Ethan noted that this, too, was something Darius had decided, a choice made in a sub-basement that he was now carrying upstairs with him. Floor 30, floor 31. At the landing for 32, Ethan pushed through the stairwell door and stopped. The corridor leading to the security operations hub was not empty. Ronald Fitch was standing outside the hub door with two men who were not in Helix uniforms and who had the posture of people preparing to leave in a hurry. He was holding a tablet and speaking into a phone, and he had the slightly elevated color of a man who had been running a complicated operation and was now watching it fail in real time. He saw Ethan, then he saw Darius. Something happened in Fitch's face, a rapid sequence of calculations arriving at conclusions he didn't like. He lowered the phone. Drake, he said, as though they were still colleagues, as though this were a corridor he was allowed to be in. The charges are disabled, Ethan said. The Federal Coordination Center has been on the hard line in that room for the last... He checked his watch. 32 minutes. Your position reports, your financial communications with Hale, and everything else on those operations tablets have been flagged for seizure. He looked at the two men with Fitch. You want to put those bags down? Neither man moved immediately. Then Darius spoke. He's telling you the truth. His voice carried the specific weight of someone whose opinion on the matter everyone in the corridor understood was relevant. Put the bags down. The bags went down. Fitch looked at Ethan with an expression that moved through several things before settling on something that was almost, but not quite, dignity. You're a maintenance man, he said. The same thing Torres had implied at the lobby, register of disbelief. Yeah, Ethan said. I know. The hub door opened from the inside, and Adrian Kane stood in the doorway with the hardline handset in her hand, and two federal tactical officers visible behind her who had apparently come through a different route than the one Ethan had taken, and she looked at the scene in the corridor. Fitch, the two men, the dropped bags. Darius, Ethan. With the rapid assessment of someone who had been working very hard to stay informed and was now updating her information in real time. Her eyes met Ethan's. He gave a small nod that meant, the building is not going to fall. She gave a small nod back that meant, I heard. One of the tactical officers stepped past her into the corridor and said, Federal law enforcement, don't move, in a voice that left no interpretive room, and Fitch and his two companions stopped moving, and the corridor was very briefly completely still. That particular stillness of a situation that has been moving fast for a long time and has just arrived at the moment where it stops. Ethan leaned against the wall. He was bleeding from somewhere on his left forearm. He hadn't noticed until just now, which was not unusual. The noticing always came after. A scrape from the service ladder, probably. Nothing serious. He looked at it without particular concern and then looked back at the corridor where federal officers were managing the situation with the brisk efficiency of people who had been briefed on the way in and were now executing. Darius was speaking to one of the officers in a low voice, hands still away from his body, the posture of a man voluntarily reducing himself to his components. Adrian came to stand beside Ethan. She looked at his arm. "You're bleeding," she said. "It's a scrape." "I have—" She looked at herself. No bag, no jacket pockets worth mentioning, the jacket itself too compromised to be useful. "I don't have anything." "It's fine." She looked at him for a moment. "The charges." "Disabled. Primary receivers disconnected, secondary timer interrupted. The charges are still physically attached to the column in S3, but they're inert. The disposal team will need access from the S2 hatch behind the water main on the east wall." She looked at him the way she had looked at him in the atrium, 4 floors above a stairwell in the early afternoon, when he was still just a man in a maintenance uniform telling her they needed to move. The same quality of assessment, landing differently now. "That man," she said. She meant Darius, who was across the corridor with his back to them. "He was with your team?" "A long time ago." She didn't push on it. She had the specific quality of knowing when a subject had an edge that wasn't her edge to press on. From somewhere above them, several floors, maybe more, there was the sound of a door opening and voices and the particular acoustic quality of a large space being occupied by people with authority. The federal tactical teams were on the upper floors now, moving through the executive level, finding the remnants of the operation in its various positions. And somewhere on floor 40, Vincent Hale was in an executive conference room with a phone and a tablet and a plan that had stopped working approximately 32 minutes ago and didn't know it yet. Ethan pushed off the wall. His arm protested mildly. He ignored it. "We need to get you upstairs," he said. Adrian looked at him. "Why?" "Because whatever happens next in this company happens better with you in the room where it's happening." He picked up his tool belt from where he'd set it against the wall. "And because Hale is still up there." She straightened. The gesture was small and completely automatic. The same thing she'd done before they went into the tunnels. The physical reminder to her own body. "Lead the way," she said. He did. The elevator was out. Of course it was. The building's primary power was still running on emergency backup, which meant the elevators were locked to lobby level per the automatic safety protocol, which meant Ethan and Adrian took the stairs from 32 to 40, 8 floors, and Adrian did it without complaint in shoes that were not designed for stairwells, and Ethan did it with a left arm that was stiffening around the scrape in a way that suggested it was deeper than he'd initially assessed. They didn't talk much on the way up. There wasn't much to say that the situation hadn't already said. At floor 37, they passed 2 federal tactical officers coming down who looked at them with the specific alertness of people trained to treat every individual in an active scene as a variable. Ethan held up his Helix Facilities keycard, the laminated one with his photograph and the word maintenance in green block letters, and said, "Ethan Drake, building technician. I'm the one who activated the emergency transmitter at 149. The CEO is with me." He gestured to Adrian. One officer looked at the keycard, looked at Adrian, looked at the state of both of them, the torn jacket, the scrape, the general quality of people who had been through a building rather than simply in it. "Director Okafor is on 40, the officer said. "She'll want to talk to you." "We're going to 40, Ethan said. They kept moving. The 40th floor was a different environment than the one they had left 2 hours ago. The smoke had dissipated to a thin residue that left a faint haze in the air and a smell that would probably linger for days. The emergency lighting had been supplemented by portable tactical units that the federal team had brought in, giving the executive corridor a flat, clinical brightness that made it look more like a crime scene than a corporate floor, which, Ethan supposed, was accurate. 3 officers were managing a group of Helix employees who had been found in conference rooms and offices during the sweep. Administrative staff, mostly, people who had sheltered in place when the chaos started and were now sitting in varying states of shock along the corridor wall, some on phones, some just sitting. The mercenaries who had been on this floor were gone, extracted or detained elsewhere in the building, Ethan didn't know which yet. What remained was the architecture of the operation. The smoke dispersal unit still attached to the ventilation registers. The communications equipment one of Darius's team had staged near the elevator bank, and the specific kind of disorder that results when a carefully planned event is interrupted before it can clean up after itself. A woman in federal tactical gear without the helmet, mid-40s, composed, the kind of authority that doesn't need volume, was standing at the far end of the corridor outside the executive conference room with a tablet in her hand and two agents flanking her. She saw Adrian and changed direction immediately. "Ms. Kane," she extended a hand. "Director Yara Okafor, Federal Crisis Response. We spoke on the hardline 40 minutes ago." "I remember." Adrian shook her hand. "This is Ethan Drake. He's the one who—" "I know who he is." Okafor looked at Ethan with an expression that was appraising without being unkind. "Your transmitter signal is what put us in motion. The photographs you sent to your facility's inbox were forwarded to our field office by the IT security contact at 12:07. We were already staging when the hardline call came in." She paused. "Mr. Drake, the preliminary count from the sub-basement indicates 3 disabled charges on the central structural column and 1 interrupted secondary detonation device. Is that a complete accounting?" "To my knowledge, yes. I swept the perimeter of S3 before I found the charges on the column. The floor joints along the east wall should be physically inspected by a structural engineer before anyone occupies the basement levels, but I didn't find any additional devices." Okafor made a note. "The charges are being assessed by disposal specialists now." She looked at Adrian. "Vincent Hale is in the executive conference room. He's been there since we arrived on this floor. He hasn't been detained yet. We were waiting for you." Adrian held Okafor's gaze for a moment. Something passed across her face that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite grief. The expression of someone arriving at the end of a conclusion they had been forming for a long time without enough evidence to act on it. Thank you," she said. "We'll need full statements from both of you. The building will need to be cleared before employees can return. Structural assessment, environmental check for the smoke dispersal agents, complete security system audit." Okafor glanced at Ethan. "The security system audit is going to require someone with detailed knowledge of the building's network infrastructure. Your photographs indicate a sophisticated intercept setup." "The tap is still on the secondary junction panel on floor 22, Ethan said. "I left it in place to preserve the chain of evidence. The access log on this panel will show the spoofed credential entry from 4 days ago." Okafor looked at him the way people occasionally looked at him when he said something that didn't fit the laminated card on his chest. He was familiar with the look. He didn't address it. "I'll need you available for the technical walkthrough," she said. "I'll be available." Adrian had already moved past Okafor toward the conference room door. Ethan followed, not because he had been asked to, but because the situation wasn't finished, and he was still in it, and because whatever was going to happen in that conference room was something he had been building towards since 1:49 in the afternoon, and it felt wrong to stop at the door. The conference room was large, the same room where the Meridian signing had been staged, now without the delegates, the catering, or any of the energy that had occupied it before 2 o'clock. The long table was still set with water glasses and document folders. The unsigned contract was still there, sitting at Adrian's chair where she had left it. Vincent Hale was seated at the far end of the table. He was 61 years old, and he looked it in a way that expensive grooming usually concealed, and today did not. His jacket was off, folded over the chair beside him, and his tie was loosened, and he had the particular stillness of a man who has been sitting in a room for a long time, going through the stages of understanding how badly something has failed. He had his phone in front of him, screen dark, presumably at the instruction of the agents who had been with him, and his hands were flat on the table, and when the door opened, he looked up with eyes that moved from Okafor to Adrian and then, briefly, to Ethan. The look he gave Ethan lasted approximately 1 second before he looked away. In that second, Ethan saw the moment of recognition, not of Ethan specifically, but of the category Ethan occupied, the thing Hale had failed to account for, the variable that had not been in the plan. "Adrian," Hale said. His voice was measured, the voice of a man who had decided that if he was going to sit in this room, he would sit in it with his posture intact. "I'm glad you're safe." Adrian stood at the opposite end of the table. She didn't sit down. "Vincent." She said his name with the same quality she'd used in the sub-basement. Accurate, not dramatic. "How long have you been planning this?" I think that's a conversation that should happen with legal counsel present. I'm not asking for the record. She pulled out the chair in front of her but didn't sit, just rested her hand on the back of it. I'm asking because I'd like to know. 6 years on this board. 6 years of whatever this is underneath it. I'd like to know when it started. Hale looked at her. Whatever calculation he was running resolved to something that looked almost like candor, the kind that surfaces when the practical case for concealment collapses. The Meridian contract, he said. When you brought it to the board 14 months ago, I saw what it would do for the company's valuation, and I saw that the person driving it was someone who was not going to share control easily. He said it without venom, just assessment. You're very good at what you do, Adrian. That was always going to be the problem. So you decided to take it. I decided to position myself to protect the company's long-term interests. With mercenaries and explosive charges in the foundation. Hale said nothing. Adrian pulled the chair out the rest of the way and sat down. She opened the unsigned contract and looked at the last page. The signature line, empty, her name printed beneath it in 12-point type. She closed it again. You know what I keep thinking about, she said, is the employees who sheltered in conference rooms on the upper floors for 2 hours because the building's security system went dark and they didn't know if it was safe to leave. People with families, with commutes, with ordinary lives that had nothing to do with board governance or billion-dollar contracts. She looked at him. That's what your plan actually looked like from the inside, Vincent. Not a corporate maneuver. People hiding in conference rooms. Hale looked at the table. Okafor stepped forward from the doorway. Mr. Hale, I'm placing you under arrest. She nodded to the agent beside her. You'll be read your rights and transported for processing. Hale stood. He buttoned his jacket with the automatic gesture of a man whose physical habits had outlasted the context that formed them, and then he walked to the door with the agent, and he didn't look at Adrian again, and he didn't look at Ethan at all. The room was quieter after he left. Adrian sat at the end of the table with her hand on the closed contract and didn't move for a moment. Ethan stood near the door. He wasn't sure if he should leave. The situation had a quality of completion that felt like a natural exit point, but also a quality of unfinished that he couldn't entirely define. 14 months, Adrian said. She wasn't talking to him specifically, just saying it. I've been running this company for 14 months, and the whole time, she stopped, started again. I had a board member, a security director, and an entire contracted security team working against me. And the person who actually kept this building standing was the maintenance technician whose photographs nobody bothered to look at. Ethan thought about saying something, decided against it. Your daughter, Adrian said. She looked up at him. What's her name? He blinked. Of everything she might have said, that was not what he'd prepared for. Cora. How old? 8. She's expecting you at 4:50. He checked his watch. It was 4:22. He looked at the watch for a moment with the expression of a man doing math that wasn't about numbers. I'll call the school, he said. They have an aftercare program until 6. Adrian looked at him steadily. There was something in her expression that was not pity. He would have noticed pity, but something adjacent to recognition, the specific recognition of one person seeing clearly what another person is actually made of. Go, she said. There's still the statement for Director Okafor. I'll tell her you'll come in tomorrow morning, first thing. She picked up her phone, battery at 11%, she noted with a glance, and pulled up a contact. Go get your daughter. He stood there for another moment with his tool belt and his scraped arm and his 43 viewings of a movie about a girl who turns into a bear. And something happened in his chest that was not quite emotion and not quite relief, but existed in the same neighborhood as both of them. The secondary junction tap, he said. When the technical team does the audit, the tap was wired in parallel with the primary network, but there's a secondary signal branch that routes through the elevator control system. If they miss it, the elevator cab hesitation between 14 and 15 will continue and eventually cause a fault in the cab leveling mechanism. Adrian stared at him. I noticed it on my first week, he said. Never got a work order for it. She let out a breath that was almost, not quite, but almost, a laugh. I will tell them. He nodded, picked up his tool belt, walked to the door. Drake? He stopped. The report you left on Marcus Webb's desk this morning. The grounding issue on Circuit Breaker 7, Floor 18. Yes. Is it urgent? He thought about it honestly. Within the week. I'll make sure it gets addressed." He left. The corridor outside was still busy, agents moving, employees being escorted, the general organized complexity of a federal operation processing a large space. Ethan moved through it the way he moved through everything, neither pushing nor deferring, just occupying the path of least resistance, with the economy of someone who had learned a long time ago that efficiency was its own form of invisibility. At the elevator bank, a tactical officer was managing the manual override on one of the cabs, restoring the primary power routing from the emergency panel. Ethan stopped. "The cab on the far left," he said. "When you restore the routing, you'll want to run a leveling test before you put passengers in it. There's a known hesitation between 14 and 15 that I've been meaning to write up." The officer looked at him. "You the maintenance tech?" "Yes." "I'll flag it." Ethan took the stairs. He was in the lobby at 4:31, moving past the last federal checkpoint, his laminated keycard doing its final useful work of the day, when he heard his name. He turned. Marcus Webb was standing near the lobby security desk with his clipboard and his expression of perpetual mild inconvenience, and for once the clipboard was hanging at his side rather than being actively wielded. "Drake," Marcus said. He looked at the scrape on Ethan's arm, at the tool belt, at the general state of a person who had been in a building for 9 hours and spent several of them in places buildings aren't meant to have people. Ethan waited. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "The report I got from IT this morning, about the photograph you sent." "It's handled," Ethan said. "The federal people are saying—" Marcus stopped. He looked at his clipboard, back at Ethan. "They're saying you were in the sub-basement." "Yes." "And the maintenance tunnels." "Yes." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was a man who was not accustomed to not knowing what to say, and the unfamiliarity of it showed in a way that was almost sympathetic. "I should have—" He stopped. "The report this morning, I should have—" "It worked out," Ethan said, "because it had, and because the alternative framing was not one he wanted to spend time in." Marcus nodded slowly. "The grounding issue on 18, I saw it on the log. I'll write it up properly tomorrow." "Take the day," Marcus said. "Whatever the federal people need from you, take the day." Ethan looked at him. This was, by some margin, the most considerate thing Marcus Webb had ever said to him in 3 years, and they both understood that the circumstances were sufficiently unusual that it would probably not establish a precedent. "Thank you," Ethan said. He pushed through the lobby doors and into the late afternoon light. The city outside was doing what cities do at 4:30 on a weekday, moving, loud, completely indifferent to the specific drama that had just concluded inside one of its 52-story towers. There were news vans on the far side of the police perimeter that had been established around the building, cameras pointed at the entrance, reporters doing the preparatory work of telling a story they didn't fully understand yet. Ethan walked past all of it without breaking stride, his tool belt at his hip, his keycard back in his chest pocket. He called the school from the sidewalk. The aftercare coordinator, a woman named Sandra, who had the patient exhaustion of someone who had been managing other people's children for many years, answered on the second ring. He explained briefly that he had been held at work and would be there before 6. Sandra said that was fine, and that Cora had been asking every 15 minutes and had also drawn 3 pictures which she was keeping for him. "Tell her I'm coming," he said. "I'll tell her." He put the phone in his pocket and kept walking. The subway entrance was 2 blocks from the building, and he took the stairs down without thinking about it, the muscle memory of 3 years of commuting. The platform was crowded with the early wave of rush hour, people in work clothes with tired faces and phones out, the ordinary compressed humanity of a city moving itself from one place to another. He stood among them and felt the specific unremarkable quality of it, of being a man in a gray maintenance uniform on a subway platform, indistinguishable from anyone else, and found it, as he always did, genuinely settling. On the train, he stood and held the overhead bar and watched the city pass in the window and thought about the building behind him, about the charges in the sub-basement that were now being handled by people with the right equipment and the right authority, about Darius, who was somewhere in a federal processing facility working out what the next years of his life were going to look like, about Vincent Hale in a jacket he had buttoned out of habit, about Adrian Kane, who was probably still on the 41st floor with federal agents, and a contract that was unsigned and a company that needed to be rebuilt from the security framework out. He thought about the 14 months she had been running Helix Vanguard and the specific exhaustion that would arrive later after the adrenaline cleared and the debrief ended, and she finally sat down somewhere quiet and understood the full shape of what had been underneath her the whole time. He thought about the elevator between 14 and 15, the way a building tells you what it needs, if you listen. He got off at his stop. Cora's school was 4 blocks from the station, a low brick building with a chain-link fence around the playground and a mural on the east wall that had been painted by a graduating class several years ago and depicted, for reasons that had never been fully explained to Ethan's satisfaction, a parade of animals carrying musical instruments. Cora loved the mural. She had opinions about which animals were best at their instruments that she had shared with him in significant detail. He signed in at the aftercare desk at 5:48. Sandra handed him 3 drawings without comment. The first was a horse. The second was also a horse, but this one had wings, which Sandra had apparently accepted without editorial input. The third was a gray figure with a tool belt and a large head disproportionate to its body that Ethan recognized as himself. She was very specific about the belt, Sandra said. Ethan looked at the drawing. The gray figure had a small smile that Cora had clearly labored over, visible even at a size that couldn't have been easy to render with a crayon. He folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket. "Thank you," he said. Cora appeared from the back room at a pace that was not quite running because she had been told not to run inside, and was making a genuine effort to comply while moving as fast as structurally possible without technically running. She was small for 8, with her mother's eyes and Ethan's stubborn jawline and hair that was currently escaping a braid in 3 different directions. She stopped in front of him and looked at his arm. "You have a scrape," she said. "I know. A big one. It looks bigger than it is." She looked at him with the specific evaluative intensity that 8-year-olds bring to the question of whether adults are telling them the truth. Then she appeared to decide, not that she fully believed him, but that she would accept the situation as presented for the time being. "Sandra said you were held at work," she said. "Yes." "What happened?" He crouched down to her level, looked at her face, the tiredness around her eyes that meant she had pushed through her afternoon without a proper rest, the slight smear of what appeared to be red crayon on her left cheek, the braid that was doing its best. "There was a problem at the building," he said. "Something wasn't working right. I had to stay and fix it." "Did you fix it?" He thought about S3, about the relay contact and the insulated pliers, about a device with a stop display reading 2631. "Yeah," he said. "I fixed it." She considered this. "Okay." She held up the drawing of the winged horse. "I made this one for you, but I also made it for me, so we share it." "That seems fair?" "The wings are because sometimes horses want to fly." "That's a good reason." She took his hand, the one that wasn't on the scraped arm, and they walked out of the school and down the sidewalk in the late afternoon light. And she talked about the winged horse, and about a disagreement she'd had with a friend about the correct way to draw a tail, and about a game they'd played after lunch that she had won decisively, and Ethan listened to all of it with the full attention that it deserved. The city was doing what cities always do, moving, loud, indifferent. He was home by 6:15. He made dinner, pasta with the sauce from a jar that Cora preferred to the one from scratch, a preference he had initially tried to correct and eventually decided was not worth the effort. And they ate at the kitchen table, and Cora told him about the musical animal mural at school and which elephant she thought was playing the trumpet wrong. And he told her the elephant was probably doing its best, and she accepted this with the measured skepticism of someone who expected more from elephants. After dinner, he washed the dishes, and she sat at the kitchen counter doing homework, long division, which she was approaching with the focused displeasure of someone who felt the entire system was unnecessarily complicated. And the kitchen was warm, and the evening was quiet, and the distance between this table and the sub-basement of a 52-story tower was approximately 11 miles and felt, in all the ways that mattered, considerably greater. His phone buzzed at 8:43 after Cora was in bed. A number he didn't recognize. He answered. "Drake." Adrian's voice. Clear, not tired, though she must have been exhausted. The specific non-tired quality of a person still running on something stronger than rest. "I wanted to let you know. Meridian called at 7 o'clock. Caldwell, personally." Ethan sat down at the kitchen table. The drawings were still there. Horse, winged horse, gray figure with tool belt. And they want to reschedule the signing next week if the building is cleared. A pause. He said, and I'm quoting directly, that he had never seen a corporate security response of that quality, and that they had complete confidence in Helix's ability to protect sensitive operations. Ethan looked at the drawing of himself that Cora had made, the one with the small, careful smile. He thought it was planned, he said. Apparently, he thought the entire thing was a demonstration. Another pause, and in it he could hear something that was almost amusement, but had too much weight behind it to be only that. I didn't correct him. Probably wise. The building will be cleared for limited access by tomorrow afternoon. Structural assessment came back on the foundation. The joint where the third charge was placed has minor surface damage, cosmetic only. The column is sound. She paused. You were right about the placement. If those charges had fired, the junction failure would have been catastrophic. He didn't say anything to that. Fitch gave a full statement this evening, she continued. He confirmed Hale's involvement going back 8 months. Financial records, communications, the contractor coordination, all of it documented. The federal prosecutor's office is calling it one of the most thoroughly documented corporate sabotage cases they've seen. She stopped. Which I suppose is something. It is, he said. Something. Outside his kitchen window, the city was doing its nighttime version of itself. Quieter, the traffic sounds lower, the specific acoustic quality of a place settling without ever fully stopping. He had lived in this apartment for 2 years, and he knew the sounds of it, the way he knew the sounds of every space he occupied. The particular way the pipe spoke when the upstairs neighbor ran water, the exact pitch of the elevator in the lobby, the interval between the traffic light changes on the corner. He knew buildings. He always had. Get some sleep, he said. A brief pause. You too, Drake. Her voice had something in it that was neither professional nor personal, but existed accurately in the space between. And tell Cora the winged horse concept has real merit. He looked at the drawing. She'll be glad to hear it, he said. He ended the call. The kitchen was quiet. The drawings were on the table. Outside, the city moved the way it always moved. Forward, without ceremony, carrying everything inside it without distinction or comment, the way cities do. Ethan Drake sat at his kitchen table for a few minutes more, and then he turned off the light and went to bed. The building reopened on a Thursday. Not with ceremony. Adrian had specifically declined the suggestion from Helix's communications team that a formal reopening event would be good for employee morale and media optics. The suggestion had come from a junior PR coordinator who had not been in the building during the attack and therefore had a somewhat different relationship to the word ceremony than the people who had. Adrian had listened to the pitch, thanked the coordinator for her thinking, and said no with the specific finality that ended conversations rather than pausing them. What happened instead was ordinary. The security checkpoint in the lobby was staffed by a temporary contracted team, vetted through a process that Adrian had personally reviewed, which was not how CEO involvement in contractor vetting typically worked, but which felt, under the circumstances, like the minimum appropriate level of attention. Employees badged in. The elevators ran. People got coffee from the third-floor kitchen and carried it to their desks and opened their laptops, and the building did what buildings are supposed to do, which is function without being noticed. Ethan was at work by 7. The building had a backlog. 4 days of deferred maintenance during the federal assessment period, plus the specific damage from the operation itself. Smoke dispersal residue in 3 ventilation systems, a camera housing on floor 38 that had been physically compromised by one of Darius's team during their sweep, the elevator cab on the far left of the executive bank that still needed its leveling test, and circuit breaker 7 on floor 18, which had been waiting patiently for someone to address its grounding issue for longer than it should have. He had a work order for each of them, generated by Marcus's department the previous afternoon, and he started with the elevator because it was the one that affected the most people, and because he had been thinking about it, intermittently, for 3 years. The leveling test took 40 minutes and confirmed what he'd suspected. The cab's counterweight guide rail had a slight deflection at the 14 to 15 floor junction, the result of years of minor building settle that had gone uncompensated. The fix was a guide rail shim adjustment, 35 minutes of work once the cab was locked out of service. When he released the lockout and ran the test cycle, the elevator moved between 14 and 15 without hesitation for the first time in he didn't actually know how long, longer than he'd been here. He stood in the mechanical room and listened to it run. Then he moved on to the next work order. Marcus found him on floor 22 at 10:15, which was where Ethan was completing the camera housing replacement on 38. He'd rerouted his morning to combine the camera job with a ventilation inspection on 22 that used the same access panel. And Marcus stood in the maintenance corridor with his clipboard in a slightly different posture than usual, a posture that suggested the clipboard was being carried more out of habit than operational necessity. Federal technical team finished their audit yesterday, Marcus said. Full report goes to Director Okafor and Ms. Kane. They pulled the tap off the secondary junction and processed it for evidence. I know. They asked me to walk them through the panel configuration Tuesday morning. Marcus nodded. They also found a secondary relay you didn't mention in your original report. I found it during the walkthrough. It was installed in a separate conduit that wasn't part of the initial tap setup. I think it was a backup monitoring line rather than part of the trigger architecture. I included it in my Tuesday statement. Marcus looked at him. You found it during the walkthrough? Yes. The federal technical team missed it on their initial sweep. Ethan didn't say anything to that. Marcus looked at his clipboard, at the wall, back at Ethan. I'm going to say something and I need you to just let me say it. Okay? I should have looked at your photographs. He said it without elaboration, without the cushioning language that people usually surround an acknowledgement like that with. Just the statement, plain. I had them at 11:15. I filed the thing and sent it up the chain and I didn't look at them. If I had looked at them, he stopped. It might not have changed anything, given that Fitch was the endpoint, but I should have looked. Ethan held the camera housing in both hands and thought about what to say to that. You didn't know what you were looking at, he said finally. Most people don't. You knew. I've seen things like it before. Marcus seemed to want to pursue that. The question of where and when and under what circumstances a maintenance technician develops familiarity with military-grade network intercept devices, and then seemed to decide correctly that this was not his question to ask. The after-action summary is going to reference your role, Marcus said. The federal report. I've already gotten 3 calls from reporters who somehow got my name as the facilities contact. Don't talk to them. I wasn't planning to. Marcus finally let the clipboard drop to his side. Ms. Kane's office called my department this morning. They want your personnel file updated to reflect, and I'm quoting the email here, additional technical competencies and a commendation for crisis response. He looked at Ethan. Do you know what that means practically? It means someone wrote an email. It means a pay adjustment, Drake, and a title review. Ethan finished securing the camera housing and tested the mounting. I'm a maintenance technician. You might be something else now, if you want to be. Ethan picked up his tool bag. Is the circuit breaker on 18 still on my list for this afternoon? Marcus looked at him for a long moment. The expression on his face was the specific expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion that he doesn't entirely know what to do with. Yes, he said. It's on your list. Then I'll see you tomorrow morning, Ethan said, and continued down the corridor. The meeting with Adrian happened at 3 o'clock, in her office on the 41st floor, which was the same office she had been standing in at 7:15 on the day of the attack, looking out at a city still gray with early light. She was at her desk when he arrived, and Priya, who had been found safe in a third-floor conference room during the federal sweep, having sheltered there with a group of administrative staff after the smoke started, showed him in with an expression that was professionally neutral in a way that suggested it was working hard to be so. The office looked the same as he imagined it always looked. Clean, organized, the 3 tablets on the desk showing different data streams. The floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city in afternoon light. Nothing about it telegraphed that the person sitting behind the desk had spent 2 hours in a sub-basement the previous week, or that the building they were in had been 47 minutes from a structural collapse that nobody else would have prevented. Adrian looked up when he came in. She looked rested in the way that people look rested when they have been running on structured sleep rather than genuine recovery, which was probably the best anyone could manage this week. Sit down, she said. He sat. She had a folder on the desk that she didn't open immediately. She looked at him across the desk with the same quality of attention she had brought to the maintenance corridors and the sub-basement ladder. Direct, not performing anything, just looking. I want to offer you a position, she said. I heard from Marcus there was a title review. What I'm offering is larger than that. She opened the folder. Chief Security Officer. The title, the office, the executive authority, and a compensation package that I had HR put together based on market rate for equivalent positions in our sector. She turned the folder to face him. He looked at the number on the top page. That's base salary. Equity and benefits are on page 2. Ethan looked at the page for a moment. Then he looked up. No, he said. She had expected this. He could tell by the fact that her expression didn't change. Tell me why, she said. He thought about how to say it accurately because accuracy mattered here. Not modesty, not performance, just the true reason. I'm not a security director, he said. I'm not a strategist or an executive. I know how buildings work. I know how systems fail and how people move through spaces under pressure and where the gaps are between what a security plan says on paper and what actually happens when something goes wrong. That's a specific kind of knowledge. It doesn't come with a corner office. Most of what a chief security officer does is exactly what you just described. The rest of it is meetings and budget presentations and managing a department of people who mostly resent being managed. He looked at her. I'm not good at any of that. Adrian sat back slightly. She picked up a pen and turned it between her fingers. Not nervously, just thinking with her hands, which he had noticed she did. Then what do you want? He had thought about this. Not in the abstract way that people think about what they want. The vague aspirational thinking that doesn't have a specific shape, but the practical way. The way he thought about circuit boards and load paths and the specific stress points in a system under pressure. The security rebuild, he said. The structural assessment on the foundation identified 3 other areas of the sub-basement level that have similar access vulnerabilities to the one that was exploited. The secondary network junction on 22 isn't the only one in the building. There are 4 others that run on comparable architecture and could be compromised the same way. The maintenance tunnel network that I used to move through the building is also accessible to anyone with a facilities-level credential, and the credential system hasn't been audited for inactive accounts in at least 18 months, he paused. I want to fix those things. Not on paper. Actually fix them. Adrian looked at him. I want to work through the building the same way I've been working through it for 3 years, he continued, systematically, from the bottom up. Every access point, every network junction, every credential pathway and physical vulnerability. I want to build a security architecture that starts with how buildings actually function, rather than how security presentations say they function. He stopped. That's the job I want. She was quiet for a moment. That's also the job of a chief security officer, she said. The chief security officer gets a title and a department and a seat at the executive table. I want the work without the rest of it. My uniform, my tool belt, my floor access. Different pay scale if you think the work warrants it, but not an office, not a department, not a title that means people treat me differently than they did before. Why does that part matter to you? It was a real question, not a rhetorical one. He had noticed that about her. She asked real questions and then waited for real answers, rather than filling the space herself. Because the thing that made Tuesday useful was that nobody knew who I was, he said. The mercenaries didn't account for me because I was invisible to them. I walked through that building for 3 years and fixed things and listened to systems and learned every inch of the infrastructure because that's what the job required, not because I was trying to be a hero in reserve. He looked at the folder on the desk. The minute I become something with a title and a profile, I stop being useful in the same way. Adrian looked at the folder too, then she closed it. I want to push back on one thing, she said. Okay. The invisibility you're describing, it's real, and I understand why you value it. But it also meant that on Tuesday morning, your photographs went to the bottom of a stack because nobody knew they should take you seriously. Nobody looked at them. She held his gaze. I don't want a Helix Vanguard where the person who actually understands the building has to fight to be heard because nobody can see them. He thought about Marcus in the corridor, the email that went unread, Torres at the lobby desk with the photograph sitting next to a half-eaten protein bar. That's fair, he said. So here's what I'm actually proposing. She pulled the folder back and turned to page 3. Independent security infrastructure consultant. Not a department head, not an executive. A single-person advisory role that reports directly to me with full building access and the authority to require action on any vulnerability assessment you submit. Your workspace stays in the maintenance area because that's where the work is. Your compensation reflects the actual value of what you do. She pushed page 3 toward him. And your name is on the security briefing as the primary systems consultant, which means when something goes wrong, the people who need to know who to call can find you in under 30 seconds. Ethan looked at page 3. One condition, he said. She waited. The work stays out of press releases. I can't promise that entirely. The federal case against Hale and Fitch is going to generate coverage, and your role in Tuesday is part of the record. I understand that. I mean going forward. The security rebuilding work. I don't want it in company communications or external announcements. It works better if the outcomes are visible and the process isn't. Adrian considered this. Agreed, she said, on one condition of my own. He waited. The elevator between 14 and 15. If you find something like that again, something that's been running wrong for years and nobody noticed, you tell me directly, not through the facility's inbox. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted in a way he wasn't entirely in control of. Not a smile, not quite, but adjacent. Deal, he said. She extended her hand across the desk. He shook it. The Meridian contract signing happened the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after the original ceremony date. There were no cameras, no media access, no catering beyond a table of coffee and water that Priya had organized. The Meridian delegation came in through the regular lobby entrance, badged through the security checkpoint with visitor credentials that had been generated through a process Ethan had reviewed the night before, and took the elevator, the one that now ran smoothly between 14 and 15, to the 41st floor. Caldwell, the silver-haired lead negotiator, shook Adrian's hand and said that Helix Vanguard had demonstrated in his 40 years of contract negotiation a level of operational resilience he had rarely encountered. He said it with the sincere enthusiasm of a man who genuinely believed the building's response to a coordinated mercenary attack had been a planned security demonstration. Adrian thanked him without correcting him. The contract was signed at 11:17 in the morning, $8.4 billion. The Meridian Group's largest single infrastructure security contract in the company's history. Adrian put her pen down on the table and looked at the signature for a moment. Just a moment. Before Priya collected the documents for processing. Ethan was on floor 22 at 11:17, finishing the installation of an upgraded access panel on the secondary network junction. A hardened housing with a dual authentication latch and a tamper detection sensor that would flag to the security monitoring system within 4 seconds of unauthorized contact. He was working alone, which was how he preferred it, with a portable speaker on the floor beside him, playing a low-volume radio station that Cora had programmed into his phone because she had strong opinions about what he listened to during work. She was not wrong about the music. He had been forced to concede this. He finished the installation and tested the tamper sensor 3 times before he was satisfied with its response time. Then he photographed the completed installation from 4 angles and uploaded the images to the new documentation system he had set up over the weekend. A straightforward digital log that kept a time-stamped record of every access panel, network junction, and security component in the building, cross-referenced with maintenance history and vulnerability status. Not complicated, not expensive, just thorough. He moved to the next work order. The investigation into Vincent Hale and Ronald Fitch proceeded through the federal system at the pace federal systems move, which is to say, deliberately and without drama. By the end of the first month, the indictments had been filed. Hale on 6 counts, including corporate conspiracy, obstruction, and criminal endangerment. Fitch on 8 counts that additionally covered fraud and violations of his licensed security contractor status. 4 members of the Helix security team who had accepted payments to abandon their positions faced separate charges. The prosecutors, who had described the evidentiary record as unusually comprehensive, indicated that the combination of Darius Cole's cooperation agreement and the financial documentation recovered from Hale's communications made the cases straightforward by the standards of corporate criminal proceedings, which were not a category known for simplicity. Darius Cole received a cooperation agreement that the federal prosecutor described in a hearing Ethan did not attend, as reflecting substantial assistance to the investigation and a demonstrated willingness to accept responsibility. He would serve time. Ethan had known that was the likely outcome from the moment in S2 when Darius handed over the device. He didn't have strong feelings about it. Not forgiveness, not its opposite, something more complicated and less named than either. Darius had made choices over 11 years that had accumulated into a Tuesday afternoon in a sub-basement, and the accounting for those choices was not Ethan's to manage. What he did do, on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after the attack, was write a letter. Not to the court. He had no standing in the legal proceedings and no desire to acquire any. To Darius directly, through the federal facility where he was held pending sentencing. He wrote it by hand because that seemed right, and because he was not a person who communicated important things by typing them. He wrote that he understood the one more contract logic. He wrote that he had been closer to it himself than most people knew. He wrote that Darius had a 12-year-old son in Portland who would be 14 or 15 by the time the sentencing and appeals process resolved, which was not a good age but was not an impossible age either. He had known fathers who had come back from worse absences and rebuilt something real. He wrote that building something real was slower and less dramatic and more boring than any of the things they had both done in the years before, and that in his experience the boring was the point rather than a drawback. He sealed the envelope and mailed it. He didn't know if Darius would read it. He didn't know if it mattered. He had said what seemed true and accurate, and that was the thing he had control over. 3 months after the attack, Adrian called a company-wide meeting in the Helix Vanguard atrium. All 412 employees gathered in person or connected by internal video for the satellite offices. Ethan was not in the atrium. I was on floor 34 running a diagnostic on the building's fire suppression sensor network, which had been flagged in his audit as having 3 nodes with degraded response times that needed recalibration before the quarterly safety inspection. He had the meeting running on his phone, propped against his tool bag, because Priya had sent him a calendar invitation with the subject line, "Your attendance requested," and a follow-up message that said, "Please, Ethan." He listened while he worked. Adrian spoke for 11 minutes. She talked about what had happened in the building on that Tuesday, not the version that the press coverage had assembled from federal statements and corporate communications, but the actual version, the one that started with photographs nobody looked at and ended in a sub-basement with a man in a gray maintenance uniform and a pair of insulated pliers. She was specific. She named Fitch. She named Hale. She described the security team's departure from the executive floor in plain language that left no interpretive room. And then she pulled up the security footage. Ethan's hands stopped moving. He had known, abstractly, that the camera network had been offline during the blackout. What he had not known, what nobody had told him, was that the backup camera system on the executive floor ran on an independent circuit and had continued recording throughout the 12-second blackout and everything that followed. That footage showed, in the flat amber glow of emergency lighting, 4 security contractors in Helix uniforms moving toward the stairwell while the smoke came in. And it showed one person in a gray maintenance uniform moving in the opposite direction. He listened to the atrium go quiet. He kept his eyes on the sensor node he was recalibrating, because the work was there, and it needed doing regardless of what was happening on 34 floors below him, and because he had been a person who moved toward problems rather than away from them, for long enough that it was not the remarkable thing to him that it apparently was to other people. Adrian said, "Every person who walked out of this building safely on that Tuesday afternoon owes that safety, in some part, to someone who had no obligation to stay, no authority to act, and no guarantee that anything he did would work. He stayed anyway. He acted anyway. He fixed it anyway." The atrium was very quiet. "His name is Ethan Drake," she said. "He fixes things in this building. If you see him, you don't need to say anything to him because he will find it uncomfortable and will immediately find a reason to be somewhere else in the building." Ethan looked at his phone. "But I wanted you to know his name," she said. He set the phone face down on top of his tool bag. He finished the sensor recalibration. The 4th node took longer than the others. The housing was older and the calibration port was slightly corroded, which required cleaning before the adjustment tool would seat properly. He worked through it methodically, and when the node's response time registered correctly on his diagnostic reader, he made a note in the documentation system and moved to the next one. When the meeting ended and the atrium below him filled with the sound of people returning to their afternoon, Ethan Drake was on floor 34 doing what he had been doing for 3 years and what he would continue doing tomorrow and the day after that, listening to a building, hearing what it needed, and fixing the things that were broken. He thought about what Adrian had said. Not the part about him, that part he was putting somewhere he didn't plan to revisit, but the part at the end of her remarks, which he had heard while his hands were on a sensor housing, and which had landed with the particular accuracy of something true. She had said, "The most important person in any system is usually the one you don't see, not because they're hiding, because they're working." He had thought, hearing it, about all the things that kept a building running. The systems that functioned without announcement, the mechanisms that held weight without credit, the 10,000 small repairs that accumulated over years into the fact of a structure that stood and did what it was supposed to do. He had thought about how few people, walking into an elevator or swiping a badge, or looking out a window at a city that held itself together through 10 million invisible interdependencies, ever thought about the specific human labor underneath all of it. He thought about his own father, who had worked maintenance in a hospital for 31 years, and who Ethan had watched come home with his uniform, the same color as Ethan's own uniform, and who had never described his work as anything other than what needed doing. His father had fixed the things that were broken in a building full of sick people and had done it quietly and without recognition, and had come home each evening and made dinner and asked Ethan about his day, and the asking had been, looking back on it now, the thing that made everything else possible. He understood that now in a way he hadn't at 8 years old. The way you understand things by arriving, eventually, on the same ground where someone else stood before you. He thought about Cora, who was in school right now drawing horses and arguing about elephant musicianship and building the kind of ordinary childhood that was only ordinary because the things that could interrupt it were mostly held at bay by the accumulated effort of people nobody noticed. He thought about the specific weight of that, not as burden, but as purpose. The thing that got him out of bed at 6 in the morning and into the building by 7. The thing that made a circuit breaker's grounding issue feel worth addressing carefully rather than cursorily. The thing that made him press a transmitter at 1:49 instead of walking away from information that wasn't his job to act on. He didn't think of himself as a hero. The word had a shape that didn't fit the experience. The experience was cold concrete floors and the smell of machine oil and the specific anxiety of a relay contact that might complete a circuit if he moved wrong. It was not dramatic from the inside. It was just a series of problems that needed solving and a set of skills that happened to be available to solve them. What he was someone who showed up. That was the whole of it. The rest was just details. He finished the 4th sensor node and moved to the 5th and last one, which was mounted near the ceiling of a maintenance corridor and required the step stool from his tool bag. He set it up, climbed it, and began the process again, cleaning the housing, seating the calibration tool, waiting for the diagnostic reader to register. The corridor was empty and quiet and hummed with the low electrical presence of a building doing its work. On a rooftop, 4 weeks later, on an evening in October when the city had its first real cold snap and the light was going early and the wind had that quality of purpose that October wind gets, Ethan stood with Adrian Kane and looked at the skyline and said almost nothing for a long time, which was comfortable rather than awkward because they had established, somewhere in the maintenance tunnels of a building under siege, that silence between them was a functional mode rather than a social failure. Adrian had a coffee that was getting cold. Ethan had his hands in his jacket pockets. "The foundation assessment final report came in this morning," she said. "The engineering firm is recommending a preventive reinforcement on the east load-bearing elements in the S2 level. It'll take about 3 weeks and requires partial closure of the parking structure." I saw the draft. They're right about the east elements. There's also a drainage issue in the northwest corner of S3 that isn't in their report. I found standing water during my last inspection. I'll write it up. Send it directly to the engineering firm. I've added you to the project contact list. Okay? The wind moved across the rooftop, and the city held its noise below them, and the lights were coming on in the buildings across the skyline, one window at a time, the particular way a city lights itself for evening. "Do you ever miss it?" Adrian asked. He looked at the skyline. "The military?" he said. "Not necessarily, just the other version of this. The version where the stakes were always this high." He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he thought about things. "No," he said. And then, because that wasn't entirely complete, "I miss the people, some of them, the ones who were worth missing." He thought about Darius in S2, sitting on the floor with his hands on his knees, about a 12-year-old in Portland who was 14 months away from his father showing up. But the work itself, the high stakes, the constant pressure, the idea that what you're doing matters because people might die if you don't. He stopped. You can find that anywhere if you do the work right. The stakes are always real. They're just quieter. Adrian looked at him. A grounding issue on circuit breaker 7, she said. Exactly. She drank the cold coffee, made a face about it being cold, drank it anyway. Below them, 412 people had gone home to their families. The building was settling into its nighttime self. Reduced load, lower lighting, the mechanical systems dialing back to their overnight configurations. It breathed differently at night. Ethan had noticed that from his first week and had never lost the awareness of it. Go home, Drake, Adrian said. Cora's going to have opinions about dinner. She always has opinions about dinner. Is that a problem? He thought about the jar of pasta sauce in the cabinet, and the horse drawings on the kitchen table, and the braid that was always coming apart, and the 43 viewings of a movie he now knew by heart. No, he said, it's not a problem. He left the rooftop. He took the elevator down, the one that now ran smoothly between 14 and 15, and walked through the lobby and badged out at the security checkpoint and pushed through the front doors into the October cold, and the city received him the way it always did, without comment, without ceremony, as one more person among millions moving through it at the end of an ordinary day. He walked to the subway. He went home. And the building stood behind him, solid and lit and full of the invisible work of 100 systems that functioned because someone understood them, holding everything inside it the way buildings are supposed to, quietly, without being asked, without expecting to be thanked. That was the job. It always had been.